On Christmas Eve 1945, 19-year-old Marion Sodder, the oldest of 10 siblings, surprised 3 of her younger sisters with toys she had bought from the dime store where she worked in downtown Fayetteville, West Virginia. Excited by the magic of the holidays and the gifts they received from their sister, Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, begged their mother, also Jenny, to let them stay up later. Their mother agreed, as long as Maurice, 14, and Louis, 9, did their chores, which included feeding the chickens and bedding the cows down for the night. George Sodder, the head of the household, was already asleep upstairs, as were 2 of his older sons, 22-year-old John and George Jr., who was 16, as the trio had been working hard all day. Having received assurances from her younger sons that the animals would be tended to, Jenny took her youngest daughter, 3-year-old Sylvia, up to bed. Only one of the Sodder children, 17-year-old Joe, was away from home as he was serving in the military at the time. Sometime after midnight, Jenny was woken from her sleep by the telephone ringing. Puzzled as to who would be calling at that time of night, she ran downstairs to answer the call. A woman's voice asked for someone whose name Jenny didn't recognize, while in the background it sounded like a party was taking place, with laughter and glasses clinking sounding loudly in Jenny's ear. Jenny told the caller that she had the wrong number and hung up, but not before hearing what was later described as weird laughter. As Jenny made her way back to bed, she noticed that the light was still on downstairs and the curtains had not been drawn, while the door was also unlocked. Marion was asleep on the couch, and Jenny surmised that the younger children had simply forgotten to turn off the light and close the curtains before heading up to bed in the attic. Doing what she assumed her children had forgotten to do, Jenny returned to bed and fell asleep. Around 30 minutes later, Jenny's sleep was interrupted once again, this time by the sound of something landing loudly on the roof, followed by a rolling sound. With no further sounds evident, Jenny fell asleep for the 3rd time, only to be roused once again just 30 minutes later by the smell of smoke. A fire was already taking hold. Jenny woke her husband, who in turn woke his 2 older sons. The staircase to the attic, where the younger Sodder children slept, was already on fire, so George and Jenny, along with Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., screamed frantically to wake them before fleeing the burning building, with plans to rescue the younger siblings via the outside of the house. John initially reported that he had run up the stairs to try and wake his siblings, but later recanted his story and said he had only called up to them and hadn't actually seen them. In a bizarre series of twists, George's plans were thwarted, and the couple, along with the 2 older boys as well as Marion and Sylvia, were forced to watch, horrified, as the house continued to burn ferociously, with 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, trapped inside. By the time the fire crew arrived at around 8 a.m., the fire was all but out, and the house had been reduced to ash. The Sodders who had escaped stood helplessly by as the charred remains of the house were examined, waiting for news of their children who had surely perished. However, when Fire Chief F.J. Morris came to speak to George and Jenny at around 10 a.m., he told them no human remains had been found. So what had happened to the younger Sodder siblings? George Sodder, aka Giorgio Soddu, was born in Sardinia, Italy in 1895. At the age of 13, Giorgio, along with an older brother, moved to the United States, although the brother returned to Italy as soon as they had passed through customs. Giorgio was alone. Determined to make it on his own, Giorgio took what work he could find, bringing supplies to railroad workers, before finding more stable work a few years later as a truck driver. Ambitious and dedicated, Giorgio, or George as he came to be known, eventually started his own trucking company, delivering dirt to construction sites and later moving into the coal industry. In 1922, George Sodder married Jenny Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter and fellow Italian who had moved to the US when she was a young child. The couple settled in Fayetteville, where for the next 20 or so years, they welcomed and raised their 10 children. Fayetteville had a large Italian community, and the Sodders became an integral part of that community. Indeed, they became known as one of the most well-respected middle-class families around, according to a local official. There was one bone of contention that caused a fair bit of unease within the community, however. George was not shy about speaking out against the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Despite these views and the occasional spats which occurred because of them, the Sodders thrived and George's business went from strength to strength. Until, that is, Mussolini was deposed and executed on the 28th of April 1945. Warnings. In October of the same year, a life insurance salesman who was later identified as Rosser Long visited the Sodders' home. Some reports state that the salesman himself became irate when George refused his services, telling George that his house was going to go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed, further adding, "You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." However, more recent reports state that Long was employed by a former co-worker of George by the name of Fiorenzo Iannotolo, the director of the Fayetteville County National Bank. He had co-signed a loan that George had taken out and was named as a beneficiary of $15,000, or around $265,000 today, which he allegedly upped to $17,500, around $310,000 today, without George's knowledge or consent. At around the same time, a stranger has shown up at the Sodders' door looking for work. During his visit, he had wandered through to the back of the house. Pointing to 2 fuse boxes, he told George that they would cause a fire someday. George found it an odd remark, especially as the house had been rewired just a few months earlier when a new electric oven had been installed and pronounced safe. These verbal threats weren't the only odd happenings in the run-up to the fire, though. In the lead-up to that fateful Christmas, a stranger had been spotted by the older Sodder boys, watching the younger children's intently from inside his parked car as they made their way home from school. According to some, Mrs. Sodder was also aware of the watchful stranger, but deemed it none of her business as he was free to do whatever he wanted on a public road. A series of bizarre coincidences. When George and Jenny fled the Beckwith Road house with 4 of their children, George knew he could try and reach them from outside. He had a ladder stored in the yard and would use it to access the attic and entice the children out one by one, carrying them to safety with the help of his 2 older sons. However, the ladder was nowhere to be seen and was later found around 75 feet away from the house at the bottom of an embankment. Desperately, George turned to one of his 2 trucks. If he could park it right below the window, he could climb on top of it and rescue the children that way. The first truck wouldn't start, so he ran to the second truck. That one also failed to start, despite the fact that both trucks had been driven the day before with no problems at all. In the meantime, Marion had tried to call the emergency services and found that the phone was dead, presumed to be because of the fire, so she ran to a neighbor's house. The operator failed to answer the call. The same thing happened when another neighbor tried to call. Frantic, one of the neighbors drove into town and tracked down the fire chief, F.J. Morris, who raised the alarm. It was a crude service at best, manned by volunteers with little training, and the alarm was simply a phone tree system in which one firefighter would call another one, who would then call another, and so on. The fire chief himself claimed he couldn't drive the fire truck, and by the time the crew arrived some 7 hours after the fire started, there was little they could do but sift through the ashes for evidence. It was quickly determined that the children had perished in the fire, yet there were no remains found. Despite this, the coroner's office issued death certificates for all 5 children on December 30th and listed their cause of death as either fire or suffocation. The doubting begins. The family initially accepted that their children had died in the fire, and on December 29th, George filled the wrecked basement of the house with dirt in order to create a memorial. But in the days and weeks that followed, the doubts began to creep in. Jenny couldn't believe that no trace of the missing children was found in the ashes, and decided to conduct some experiments of her own by burning animal bones to see what would happen in the fire. Each time, a pile of bones remained. How was it then that parts of household items were still recognizable in the aftermath, yet none of her beloved children? Jenny took her questions to a local crematorium where she was told that even after 2 hours at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, human bones would remain. It had taken just 45 minutes for the Sodder house to be razed to the ground. A telephone repairman also told them that the reason their phone wasn't working on the night of the fire, although it had been just after midnight when the mystery caller laughed down the phone, was because the lines had been deliberately cut and not destroyed in the fire at all. A neighbor came forward and reported seeing 2 men, named as Lonnie Johnson and Dave Adkins, stealing some equipment used for removing engines from vehicles from the Sodders' property around the time of the fire. Johnson was questioned and admitted cutting the wire, but claimed that he thought it was a power line. Adkins escaped charges by joining the army, while Johnson pled guilty to theft and received a small fine. The 2 men, according to Johnson, had arrived in a taxi from a party at his apartment, although the alleged taxi driver has never been traced. The official report claimed that the fire was caused by faulty wiring, yet both George and Jenny remembered that the lights had remained on during the fire, something which could not have happened had the fire been electrical in nature. The doubts continued to mount. During a visit to the site of the fire, little Sylvia Sodder found a hard rubber object which George described as a napalm pineapple bomb or hand grenade. Jenny remembered the thud shortly before the fire started. Could the bomb have been the cause of the fire? Even more bizarre was the fact that a private detective named C.C. Tinsley discovered that, despite telling the Sodders that no human remains had been found, Morris had in fact confessed to having found a heart which he had hidden in a box and buried in the grounds. Morris agreed to show George and Tinsley where the box was. Having dug the box up and taken it to a local funeral director for examination, George and Tinsley discovered that the heart was in fact a cow's liver which had never even been exposed to fire. The fire chief's excuse was that by fabricating the evidence, he hoped the family would accept that the children had perished and find some sort of closure. Sightings. As is the case with most missing persons, many people claim to have spotted the children in the period following the fire. A woman reported that she had seen the children looking out of a passing car window on the night of the fire, while another said she had served them breakfast 50 miles away on the morning after the fire, and mentioned that she had seen a car with Florida license plates in the parking lot at the same time. Another witness came forward to say that she had seen 4 of the children a week later at a hotel where she worked, along with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction. She claimed, "I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning." More sightings followed, including a woman who claimed that Martha was in a convent in St. Louis, and another witness who said that the children were living with one of Jenny's relatives in Florida. Every sighting was followed up by George, including his own belief that a newspaper photo of a schoolgirl in New York was, in fact, his own daughter, Betty. Despite him driving more than 500 miles to see her, her parents refused to let him speak to her, and he had to return home alone. The investigation. George Sodder tried to enlist the help of the FBI and received a reply from J. Edgar Hoover himself, who said, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." He went on to say that his agents would assist if the local law enforcement agreed. Fayetteville Police and Fire Department declined the offer of help. The private investigator hired by the Sodders also discovered that Fiorenzo Iannotolo, who had threatened George Sodder, was on the jury which went on to deem the fire accidental, along with F.J. Morris, the fire chief, Fiorenzo's cousin Cleante Iannotolo, and the insurance salesman Russell Long. In 1949, a new search was conducted at the site of the former Sodder's home. Far more thorough than the somewhat perfunctory search conducted in the immediate aftermath, This search uncovered several objects, among which were several pieces of human vertebrae. The investigation was overseen by Oscar Hunter, a pathologist from Washington, D.C., and the remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institute for examination. Specialist Marshall T. Newman concluded that the human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy 14.5 years old to show age 16 or 17 maturation. However, the bones showed no sign of having been in a fire, and it was concluded that they had been brought in when George had filled in the basement shortly after the fire. It was later determined that the remains had come from a Mount Hope cemetery. The case was eventually closed. As a last resort, the family erected a billboard along Route 16 offering a reward of $5,000, which was later increased to $10,000, along with photographs of the 5 missing children. More than 20 years later, Jenny received an envelope with a Kentucky postmark which contained a photograph of a man in his 20s. On the back of the photo it read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illil boys, A90132 or 35. With no return address, the family hired another private investigator to go to Kentucky in search of the man in the photo, who bore a close resemblance to Louis, but the PI was never heard from again. The closest George and Jenny allegedly came to uncovering the tragedy came in 1967. According to some unsubstantiated reports, the Sodders received a letter from a woman in Houston who had met 2 men in a bar. This woman claimed that one of the men confessed while drunk that he was, in fact, Louis Sodder, and that the other man was his brother, Maurice. George, along with his son-in-law Grover Paxton, drove to Houston to find the woman, but they were unable to locate her. Local police, however, did track down the 2 men, who met with George and Grover, but vehemently denied being the missing brothers. In an interview with the Charleston Gazette-Mail, Grover Paxton said he died shortly thereafter, in 1969, and I think he always wondered if those were his boys. George Sodder died having never solved the mystery of his 5 children's disappearance. Jenny, his wife, wore black in mourning for the next 20 years, until her own death in 1989. The theory touted by officials investigating the disappearance of the 5 Sodder children on the surface seems plausible. If the children had gone to bed, the burning staircase would have meant that they had no way of escaping the fire and would sadly have burned to death. Though no credible remains were found, we have to remember that this happened in the 1940s, when manpower was low due to the war, and the fire service was manned largely by volunteers. Had the fire happened today, sophisticated forensics would have been able to find and identify the tiniest fragments, but sadly for the Sodder family, no such technology existed to ease their pain. While the claim that the Sodder children did die in the fire is believable, though, the report which stated that it was caused by faulty electrics seems completely improbable. George Sodder had had the wiring in his house examined by an expert prior to the fire after having a new electrical appliance fitted, and it was deemed safe. Why then would the electrics be to blame? Could it have been arson? After all, why would a stranger looking for work make his way to the back of the house, point to the fuse boxes and claim that they would cause a fire someday? And why would the refusal of life insurance result in George Sodder being told that his house would go up in flames and his children would be destroyed, citing his outspoken views on Mussolini as the reason? Yanatolo, who had commissioned Long to visit the Sodder house, was George's ex-employer and had a haulage company of his own. Was the fire his way of getting rid of his competition, or was it for the payout he would receive as George's co-signer on his loan? Then there was the sound of something hitting the roof of the house and rolling off shortly before the fire started. A late-shift bus driver who had been in the area on the night of the fire had reported seeing someone throwing balls of fire at the house. Could he have seen an arsonist in the very act of starting the devastating fire? George Sodder was thwarted at every attempt to rescue his children. His ladder had been removed from the outside of the house, and both his trucks failed to start. Could this have been a deliberate attempt to prevent a distraught father from reaching his terrified children, or was it to stop him realizing that the children had in fact been kidnapped before the fire started? Jenny's brother, Frank Cipriani, lived in Florida. Could he have known about the planned attack and rescued as many of the Sodder children as he could before the fire broke out? The photo, which Jenny received 20 years after the fire, mentioned the name Frankie on the back. Some speculated that it could have been referring to Louis's uncle or Frank Cipriani's own son, who was also named Frank. In addition, the mysterious numbers on the back of that photograph could have been in relation to the postal code for Palermo, Italy, giving clues as to the children's whereabouts. Many people believed that George had upset the wrong people when he publicly denounced the Italian dictator. Were the 5 children taken as some form of retribution? Perhaps the children survived elsewhere and were told that their parents would be killed if they ever revealed the truth. Stories of mafia involvement were also touted. It's true that George Sodder never spoke about the reasons he fled Sardinia in his very early teens, leading to speculation that he had to leave, but these stories lack any sort of credibility or evidence to back them up. The surviving Sodder children certainly considered the possibility that the mafia had been trying to extort money from George Sodder, and the fire was the price he paid for refusal, going on to theorize that the children had possibly been taken to Italy and sworn to secrecy. In spite of the ruling that the fire was an accident, it seems clear that the events of that Christmas Eve, during which the Sodder children disappeared, were caused by arson. George's electrics had been passed by a qualified electrician, and the Christmas lights in the house had continued to shine during the fire, suggesting that the electrics in the house were sound. Who might have started the fire is less clear. George certainly had a few enemies, but whether it was Fiorenzo Iannitolo, who stood to inherit a small fortune from the clause in George Sodder's mortgage, or someone who took exception to George's opposition to the now-deceased Italian dictator, we will probably never know. Some people even speculated that the children had been taken for child trafficking purposes. Certainly, the fact that George's ladder had been moved and both his trucks were inoperable strongly suggests tampering, as does the cut phone line. Was the strange call that Jenny Sodder answered shortly before the fire a way to check whether the line had been cut so the arsonist knew when to start the fire? Jenny stated that she heard laughter and glasses clinking. The man arrested for theft said he came from a party, so were they in it together? The female caller was tracked down and ruled out after claiming she had simply called the wrong number, but was there something more sinister going on? We believe the most plausible explanation is that the Sodder children did perish in the fire, and that the fire was started deliberately, possibly by Fiorenzo Iannitolo. While reports stated that the house burned to the ground in just 45 minutes, it smoldered for a long time afterwards. When George filled in the basement with dirt just 4 days after the fire, it seems likely that he trapped residual heat under the dirt, which meant that any remaining evidence disintegrated. The first investigation immediately following the fire was cursory at best, and by the time the second investigation was launched in 1949, all evidence had disappeared. The fact that items belonging to the family were found in the second investigation, including coins, shingles, and part of a dictionary when bones were not unearthed, remains a mystery that does cast doubt even on this most likely scenario.